In the heart of a quiet African town, surrounded by red soil roads and ancient baobab trees, stood a church that everyone trusted, a place where broken people came to feel whole again. And it was there that Abina first placed her faith, not only in God, but in Pastor Elisha, a man whose voice carried authority and comfort like warm rain after drought. And Abina, a young widow known for her kindness and devotion, had lost her husband 2 years earlier to a sudden illness that left her soul cracked with grief. So when Pastor Elisha visited her home with words of prayer and promises of divine healing for her wounded heart, she believed him without question, because in her culture, pastors were seen as God's chosen messengers, men who spoke truth and could never lead one astray. And Abina began attending private counseling sessions at the church after evening prayers, where the pastor spoke softly about faith, destiny, and sacrifice, often telling her that God had revealed special things about her life that only he could interpret. And at first his words brought comfort, but slowly they began to confuse her, as he insisted that her blessings were blocked by spiritual enemies who envied her future, enemies who could only be defeated through secret prayers conducted late at night, far from curious eyes. And Abina noticed how his tone changed during these sessions, how his eyes lingered too long, and how his prayers felt less about God and more about control. Yet she silenced her doubts, because questioning a pastor felt like questioning God himself. And in the village, people spoke highly of Pastor Elisha, praising his miracles, his new car, and the way influential leaders bowed before him. So Abina convinced herself that her discomfort was simply fear leaving her body, just as he said, but whispers had already begun circulating among the women of the church. Hushed conversations that stopped when Abina approached. Stories of young women who grew distant from their families after becoming close to the pastor. Women who left the church suddenly or moved away without explanation. And one evening, as Abina waited alone in the dark church hall for another special prayer, a cold realization crept into her heart that something was terribly wrong, because true faith never demanded silence, secrecy, or fear. And as the church door closed behind Pastor Elisha that night, Abina felt trapped between her belief and her instinct, unaware that the choice she was about to make would expose a truth that would shake the entire town and test the meaning of trust, faith, and courage. The days following that night weighed heavily on Abina's spirit, as if an invisible hand pressed against her chest whenever she thought of the church. Yet she continued attending services because, in her town absence, invited suspicion, and suspicion invited judgment, and Pastor Elisha noticed her silence immediately, calling her aside after Sunday worship with a smile that felt rehearsed, reminding her that spiritual growth often came with discomfort and that the devil always attacked those chosen for greatness. Words that stirred fear rather than peace, and he urged her to attend another late-night prayer, insisting it was the final step before her breakthrough. But this time Abina hesitated, her instincts louder than his voice, though she nodded out of habit and respect. And that night, as she walked home under a sky heavy with stars, she remembered her mother's teachings about wisdom and discernment, lessons she had buried beneath grief and blind faith. And for the first time she wondered why a servant of God would need secrecy to perform holy acts, why prayers required isolation instead of light. And these questions followed her into sleep, where dreams of locked doors and muffled cries haunted her rest. And the next day she sought comfort from Amma, an older woman in the church, known for her quiet strength. But Amma's face tightened when Abina mentioned the private prayers, and after a long silence, she warned her gently that not every man who stood at the altar stood with God, revealing that years earlier her niece had fallen into despair after similar counseling, leaving the village without explanation. And fear flooded Abina's heart as pieces began to fit together. Yet fear battled with guilt, because exposing a pastor could destroy the church and brand her as a liar, a temptress, or worse. And when evening came and the church bell rang for prayers, Abina stayed home, trembling, but Pastor Elisha arrived at her door unannounced, his calm mask cracking as he accused her of disobedience and spiritual rebellion, declaring that her refusal endangered not only her soul, but the destiny of her unborn future children. Words that felt like chains tightening around her mind. And he prayed loudly in her living room, commanding spirits to leave her, his voice rising until neighbors began to listen outside, forcing Abena to bow her head in shame. Yet, in that moment of humiliation, something inside her broke free, and she realized that God could not exist in fear, manipulation, or threats. And after the pastor left, she wept not for herself, but for the many women before her who had remained silent. And gathering her courage, she visited the local women's council, a group respected for settling serious matters, where she shared everything with a shaking voice, expecting disbelief. But instead she found listening ears and grim expressions, because other complaints had surfaced quietly over the years without proof, and Abina's testimony ignited a long-suppressed truth. And as night fell, she understood that speaking out had already changed her life forever. Because even if the town turned against her, she could no longer return to ignorance. And somewhere deep within, she felt a fragile but growing strength, the kind born when fear finally meets truth. By the time dawn broke over the village, Abina's name had begun to move from mouth to mouth like smoke carried by the wind, twisting and changing shape as it traveled, because truth spoken by a woman against a powerful man rarely remains untouched. And by mid-morning some called her brave, while others whispered that grief had made her unstable. Yet the Women's Council acted swiftly, summoning Pastor Elisha for questioning. And when he arrived, he wore his familiar calm, carrying a worn Bible and speaking in Proverbs, insisting that Abina was under spiritual attack and seeking attention. But his confidence faltered as more women were called forward, each sharing fragments of similar experiences: late-night prayers, warnings of curses, demands for secrecy, and lives quietly ruined until the room grew heavy with a truth too large to deny. And Abina watched as the man she once revered shifted from preacher to defendant, his words losing their power as silence replaced his authority. Yet outside the council hall, a crowd gathered, divided between loyalty and disbelief, because the church had fed, healed, and united them for years, and accepting its corruption felt like tearing out a piece of their identity. And when the elders announced that the matter would be taken beyond the village to regional authorities, outrage erupted, with some accusing Abina of destroying God's work and others demanding justice. And stones of accusation fell hardest on her, as neighbors avoided her gaze and former friends crossed the road to avoid greeting her. But in that loneliness, Abina discovered an unexpected peace, because she had chosen truth over comfort. And even when Pastor Elisha was suspended from preaching, his supporters painted him as a victim of jealousy and false testimony, spreading rumors that Abina had tempted him. And one night, hateful words were scratched onto her door, warnings to leave before worse followed, yet she refused to run, drawing strength from the women who now stood beside her, women who had found their voices through her courage. And as investigations deepened, financial records surfaced showing donations used for personal gain, along with testimonies from nearby towns echoing the same pattern. And the image of Pastor Elisha as a holy man began to crumble beyond repair. But the process was slow and painful, stretching Abina's endurance as weeks turned into months. And when authorities finally took the pastor into custody, the village did not celebrate, because victory born from betrayal carries no joy, only sober reflection. And Abina understood that faith itself had not failed them, only the man who had hidden behind it. And as she stood watching the sun set over the red earth, she felt grief for the church she had loved, but also hope that from its ruins something purer could grow, something built on light rather than shadows. After Pastor Elisha was taken away, the village entered a season of uneasy silence, the kind that follows a storm when people are unsure whether the sky will clear or rain will return. And the church doors remained closed for weeks, not by order, but by shame, because no one knew how to pray together anymore without remembering the deception that had lived among them. And Abina became both a symbol and a target, praised quietly by some, yet blamed openly by others who felt their faith had been stolen. And though the Women's Council offered protection, loneliness wrapped around her like a second skin. But in that solitude, she began to rebuild her understanding of faith, praying alone beneath the baobab tree, where her grandmother once taught her that God listened most closely to honest hearts, not loud voices. And slowly people began to approach her, first in secret and then in daylight, sharing how the revelations had forced them to question blind obedience. And among them were young men who admitted they had ignored signs because the pastor benefited them too. And this collective reflection sparked change. As the village elders proposed reforms demanding transparency, shared leadership, and the end of unchecked authority within the church, and when regional investigators confirmed the accusations and uncovered years of manipulation and abuse hidden beneath Scripture, the truth finally became undeniable, even to the most loyal followers. And the church reopened months later under new leadership chosen by the community, led by humility rather than charisma. And on the first day of worship, Abina hesitated at the entrance, afraid that stepping inside would reopen old wounds. But as she crossed the threshold, she felt neither fear nor anger, only release, because faith had returned to its rightful place between her and God, not controlled by another human being. And when she shared her testimony publicly, her voice steady and clear, the room remained silent, not in denial, but in respect. And tears flowed freely as the community confronted its shared responsibility in allowing abuse to hide behind reverence. And in that moment, Abina understood that healing was not the erasing of pain, but the courage to face it together. And though scars remained, they now served as reminders that trust must be earned, not demanded, and that true spirituality thrives in truth, accountability, and compassion. Years later, the story of what happened in Abina's village was no longer told in whispers but in lessons, passed from mothers to daughters and elders to youth, not to breed fear but wisdom, and Abina herself had grown into a quiet leader, never seeking a title yet trusted because her strength had been proven through sacrifice rather than ambition. And she helped establish safe spaces where people could speak freely about faith, doubt, and boundaries, ensuring that no single voice ever ruled without accountability again. And the church, once a symbol of blind devotion, became a place of shared responsibility where questions were welcomed and authority was balanced by transparency. And when Abina married again, she did so with prayer, guided by discernment, teaching her children that God's voice never contradicts peace, dignity, or truth. And sometimes visitors came asking to meet the woman who had exposed a powerful pastor, expecting anger or pride, but they found instead a gentle spirit who spoke more about healing than betrayal, reminding them that evil often survives not because it is strong, but because good people stay silent. And on quiet evenings, Abina still sat beneath the baobab tree, listening to the wind move through its branches like ancestral whispers, grateful not for the pain she endured, but for the courage it unlocked. Because through her suffering, the village learned that faith must never be surrendered blindly, that trust must walk hand in hand with wisdom, and that God does not hide in darkness or demand secrecy. And as the sun set over the red earth, casting long golden shadows across a healed community, Abina's story stood as a living reminder that truth, once spoken, has a way of setting not just one soul free, but an entire people. And that is why her tale endured, not as a scandal, but as a testimony that something was wrong, and someone was brave enough to say it.